and we're very privileged this evening to have Anja Shortland talk. She talked previously for us about 2 years ago because she always works in really fascinating areas, I think. So she talked last time on fraud in the art market and the economics thereof, which was a fascinating thing. I actually missed it because I had to rush off, which was a disaster. So I'm really glad this time I'm actually going to hear a talk about another fascinating topic, which she studied in detail, how a market emerged for insurance for people who got kidnapped. Which, anyone here been kidnapped? Oh, well, that's good. But it's not yet, but we'll wait. So I think it's a fascinating story and really addresses the issue of how markets emerge. They don't sort of, economics often sees markets as just sort of magically sort of just being there, assume a market. But this actually tells the story of how they actually come into being in reality. So I think it's a fascinating area. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Anja to tell us all about it.
Yeah, so I'm an institutional economist, and I'm super fascinated by trading relationships where you can't take anything for granted. So we're not actually sure what the quality of the good is, where you don't know whether you can trust your counterparty, where you don't know how to make a payment, whether the good even exists. So this particular project, I'm studying the market for hostages. I'm studying the market for people who get kidnapped by criminal organizations. And I'm contrasting that with a market for hostages that have been captured by terrorist organizations, because I'm looking at two different institutional structures. A private governance solution, which I think works remarkably well and is remarkably elegant, and then a public approach to dealing with hostages that lack all the institutional features that allow the private market to control ransoms and lead to ultimately happy outcomes. So the deal that I'm looking at requires people like us, who have no experience in this matter at all, presumably, but we're forced into a deal with the economic underworld, where we'll have to deal with, at the very least, one criminal, probably a criminal gang, quite likely a mafia or a cartel or an insurgency, a rebel organization. And how do we trade with them? And I think it's I'm always thinking of it as the trickiest trade in the world. Yeah. So you randomly paired with a trading partner. Now you don't choose your kidnapper. The kidnapper materializes. It's a random pairing. There's no trust. There's probably no history. You know nothing about your kidnapper, unless you're a local and they keep kidnapping each other's people. So we've got markets like that. You know, so tribal kidnappings in Yemen. They kidnap our daughters, we kidnap their daughters, we broadly want our daughters to remain virgins while they're being kidnapped, so we create institutions for that to work. But I'm interested in the sort of transnational kidnappings where somebody gets their car stopped in Mexico City and they find themselves in a kidnap situation and they know nothing about their counterparty. They then have to come to some one-off transactions, and we all know that one-off transactions are really, really difficult to govern. Because if you're in a one-off transaction, the question is always, how can I get the best possible outcome for myself? And the other side will do that as well. If there's not a shadow of the future, it gets very difficult. And you have to find a price. And the price is anything from what the hoodlum might settle for, who's got Uncle Ted, to the maximum amount that Uncle Ted's government is willing to pay for the return of Uncle Ted. So we don't know. The expectation of the hoodlum might be $500, but don't know what Angela Merkel is willing to pay for me, somewhere in the region of 10, 12, 15, 30 million dollars.
Oh.
So we've got a range of possible prices. And we've got to find a price somewhere in this. And this is probably not a particularly rational price setting scenario, because there'll be threats, there might be violence, there might be tears, there might be screaming, there might be guns, there might be amputations. So this is going to be problematic. Say we have got a price, then we need to work out how we're going to get the money to the kidnappers. I mean, how are we going to make $2 million appear in Kenya without being arrested at the airport? How are we then going to get it into the criminal's lair without somebody else being kidnapped? Who are we going to send? What if that person disappears with the money? I mean, this is, again, if it's a one-off transaction, you're going to have a problem keeping any middlemen true. If you do manage to get it there, it might be ambushed on the way, so you can't prove that you've paid. They might acknowledge payments, and then they still have to decide that they're going to release a potential future witness. So you can't really think of a transaction that is more difficult than that. And by Murphy's Law, something will go wrong on the way, probably quite early on. So thinking of this transaction as an economist, you think what you read in the newspapers is absolutely right. This is fraught with difficulty and almost always ends in tears. Yeah, so you shouldn't be surprised by what you read in newspapers. So, but you then might be surprised that actually this is something that is insurable. So somebody has created a product around this risk that is an attractive economic proposition that somebody can price properly, which indicates that both the frequency and the cost of it is somewhat predictable. And also, if firms are supposed to be paying for this, it's not going to be any good to them if only half the hostages come home, or 10% of the hostages come home. These firms have a duty of care towards their employees. So it's got to be a product that works well enough for almost everybody to come home. So the puzzle that motivated my research was, on the one hand, this absolutely impossible transaction, and on the other hand, the claim of insurance companies that 97.5% of hostages that are insured for kidnap for ransom come home alive. They might not have a good time in the middle, but almost everyone comes home alive. So my story is one of happy ends. How does that work? What is the system that delivers that kind of success rate in a market that you'd think is almost impossible to govern? So let's look at this market for kidnap for ransom, market for hostages, in conjunction with a market for kidnap for ransom insurance. If you want to profitably sell kidnap for ransom insurance, then plan A has got to be that your customers don't get kidnapped. Yeah? So we need to observe a structure that avoids kidnap in the very, very large majority of cases. And if somebody comes back, if somebody does get kidnapped, then plan B is you're going to get the hostage back unharmed. Yeah, but this is very much plan B. Plan A is the customers don't get kidnapped. Plan B, the hostages will come back unharmed, but importantly for a price that doesn't encourage kidnapping. Yeah? So there are several examples of markets where the ransoms just got away. There was massive ransom inflation and something turned out to be no longer insurable. So the first time this happened was in the 1970s in Argentina, where there was kidnap for ransom insurance, but basically the product left the customers to deal with all aspects of resolving the case, and then afterwards they would get reimbursed for whatever ransom they had negotiated up to a particular limit. And it turned out that people are not very good at making this transaction work, and particularly they're not super disciplined when it comes to prices, when somebody starts pointing guns or amputating fingers or ears or whatever. So start off with a ransom, $100,000. In Argentina, that's a lot of money. But what you find then is that the next person who kidnaps somebody will put that as a floor and say, can I get better than this? So the next one is 250,000, then there's one at 500,000, then 800,000, then $1 million, then 1.5 million, 3 million. You can see how this completely gets out of hand unless there's somebody who helps engender some sort of ransom discipline. So the top one was $60 million that the hostage himself negotiated, and that's, I think that's $275 million in today's terms. So this is clearly not something that's insurable. So if you want kidnapping to be insurable, basically the kidnappers cannot make a profit. And that is the structure that I'm interested in. How does kidnapping insurance help people to negotiate deals with the economic underworld that keeps kidnapping insurable? So, plan A, as I said, is that the customers don't get kidnapped. And the way this works is that you have to make a protection contract with whoever has the power to kidnap. Yeah? So I'm situating this very much in the protection theory literature. So basically, if you knew that I could kidnap you, you'd much rather pay me £100 not to. And I would happily spare myself the unpleasantness of actually kidnapping and torturing you if I could just get the money. Yeah? So kidnap insurance helps people to move safely in complex and hostile territories by creating implicit protection contracts with the economic underworld. That means that the customers don't get kidnapped because it's not in the interest of whoever owns a territory to kidnap people. And the first time I met this phenomenon, I was really surprised. So I was in Naples, and I was worried because I knew I was in mafia territory. And We're staying right in the centre of the city. And I asked the guy who owned the hotel, and he said, well, we'll be okay just going out for pizza tonight. You're perfectly safe here. This is mafia territory. And it was sort of counterintuitive. But of course, if your business model is to protect a territory, then you don't want to poach in that territory, and you make sure that there are no thieves, you make sure that there are no kidnappers, and you want as many tourists as possible to come and enjoy the city, because that means you can get more protection money from the pizza place and the taxi driver and from everyone else as well. So it's about creating a protection contract, but preferably one that doesn't get the shareholders meeting all agitated about making a protection contract with a mafia, with a cartel, with an insurgent group. So when you buy Kidnap for ransom insurance, you get security advice. And depending on where you go, that security advice is more or less prescriptive. But implicit in that security advice is a protection contract. Yeah? So you say, yes, you can go. Yes, we can find you a safe house in Bamako. Now, what makes that house safe doesn't concern me. Yeah? It's a safe house. As a customer, that's all I need to know. Or it might just be, don't use this road, use this road, use this taxi company, you can stay at this hotel, this is where foreigners eat. Yeah, so it can be quite hidden, but you know that this is a way of channeling the money into the right hands to make sure that the local community is broadly on board with people being around. Yeah, it can. So I talked to one of these security consultants, and he was just perfectly open about this. He said, if there is a Don, I hire as peasants. Yeah? The peasants don't need to fulfill any explicit security role. The fact that they're associated with the Don makes sure that there isn't going to be any trouble. And they don't have to be in a particular security role. They could be gardeners, they can be nannies. So you can bring the protector inside the firm through employment. You can bring the protector explicitly inside the firm by doing a joint venture. Yeah? Making a joint venture with the president's family is a protection contract. You can outsource your protection to the local strongman. That's what most people do in Nigeria, because you can't bring foreign private security into the country, and well, who's going to be best placed to provide the security on the ground? Well, it's whoever is already there. Or another way of crafting a protection contract is corporate social responsibility. Yeah, so if you look at corporate social responsibility programs, if you look for a protection contract, you'll see exactly the kind of thing that makes a protection contract self-enforcing. You don't give a lot of money as a down payment, but you just drip feed the money into the community in terms of scholarships, in terms of if there is investment, it will come with a juicy maintenance contract, just to make sure that everyone benefits from the continued presence of whoever is there. So with kidnap insurance, you need to get the security consulting as well, and that works in the very large majority of cases. And the protectors don't get a huge amount of money from this, because the security consultants that are associated with Kidnap for Ransom insurers are a very tight-knit group, very well networked, very able to share information. So if a protector reneges on one of these contracts, they can pull everyone out of that area by making certain activities uninsurable. Yeah? So by bundling and giving market power to Kidnap for Ransom insurers, they can pull everybody out of an oil field, massively putting the advantage with the firms acquiring protection rather than with the protector negotiating his side of the bargain. So two things there. So time horizon by the self-enforcing contract. So you give things over time, but it's also across firms. Lots of firms can be pulled at any one time. Let me briefly talk about Plan B. I think another 5-6 minutes.
Yeah.
Plan B is a crisis response. So the first thing that if somebody is reported kidnapped is that a crisis responder gets onto the case immediately. Yeah. Ideally, the person who's insured doesn't know they have insurance. So insurance is bought on your behalf by your firm, and you would not know about it. The idea being that you tell your kidnapper, phone my mum, phone my husband, phone my son, which means you have somebody fronting the negotiation who's credibly credit constrained or financially constrained, rather than saying, I'm insured for $1 million. That's the worst possible thing, and you find that your insurance is invalidated at that point. The crisis responder want to be in a position where they can manage the expectations of the kidnapper to say, well, unfortunately, once again, you've been unlucky, and yes, you may have got a white person, but this is a working class family that's mortgaged up to here with hire purchases on their cars, and 2 children that they've just financed through university, and there's nothing here. Yeah, so the preliminaries on these is, has there been a kidnap at all? The next question, is there a live hostage? Yeah, so you don't start a negotiation unless you've got the proof of life, and you've got proof that that person who's trying to negotiate with you is actually in charge of the hostage. Otherwise, all sorts of other phantom kidnap business models become possible. Yeah? So they ensure that they're talking to the right people about a hostage that's actually been kidnapped and still alive. And then, because crisis responders, again, are associated with a small number of special risk insurance that underwrite Kidnap for Ransom insurance, they see all the cases. Again, they're very closely networked, and they will most likely know the counterparty already. They will have met them before. So rather than being in a one-off transaction situation that is ungovernable with an unknown, untrusted counterparty, what we have is a bundling of these transactions, creating a time horizon where you know broadly what your counterparty is, and you know whether they have a reputation for returning live hostages. You know how much, more or less, or where to pitch your ransom at. You know that everything in this region has settled for $10,000 in 4 or 5 days. And that gives you a really good handle to manage the negotiation, help the family to play hardball, engage in what they call disruptive bargaining, and really test the patience of the opposite side. So rather than rushing in, saying, of course I'll pay whatever it takes, whatever I've got, and waiting for the opposite number to to agree to your ever spiraling offers. You pitch very low within the context, and what low is depends on the context, and that's something that we don't know. Yeah, so if everything settles at 100,000, then you don't want to start with $800 because that could really put the hostage at risk. But if you know that everything settles at 10,000, and you don't want to reward some hoodlum who just happens to have picked up a tipsy tourist with $30,000 for an afternoon's work. Yeah, because that really gets around criminal community, and then you've really got a kidnapping boom on your hands that then becomes very difficult to ensure. And that first big ransom will then set in motion that train of thought. Just as in Somalia, is there anything better to do than go into the international shipping lanes and go pirating? Well, no, there isn't. If you can get 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 million, there wasn't anything better to do in Somalia. So, crisis response is about ransom discipline, about signalling a curve, making sure that that the ransom converges at a target level that basically doesn't make kidnapping profitable. Yeah? So there's no economic profit. You might as well drive a taxi. Yeah? That's the goal. Yeah? You can stabilize kidnapping. People will have their expectations met. They will release the hostage because they need the reputation for the next one. But basically, it's not a free-for-all. You don't send the message, this is easy money. You say, send the message. A, it's really difficult because you've got to sit on this hostage for 3 months. And B, you've got to spend so much money on this, it's barely worthwhile. And that's what stabilizes kidnapping. And then crisis response. The next job that they do is organize the ransom exchange, the ransom payment, and the hostage exchange. Because again, that's something that's really prone to cheating. So if you think of it as a one-off deal, if you pay, why would they send the hostage back? If you turn up with a sack of cash, why don't they just take the cash off you, stage an ambush? If you have a middleman, what keeps the middleman straight? If they come with a hostage, what stops you from swooping in with the police and getting the hostage and not paying? You know, so this is the opportunism on a one-off deal here would be really from both sides. Yeah? Nobody trusts each other on this. So again, what we find is a really interesting institution building where people say, here we have a governance problem, here we have a trade that's really, really awkward, and people come in and they build reputations for being honest middlemen. But being an honest middleman only works if you know that you're going to take a cut from every future ransom. Or somebody says, okay, I've got a safe house. Yeah? So it's a Pakistan solution, which is very neat. So you have a shop that borders on a busy road on one side and on the mosque on the other side. So somebody can come in with the money on the front door, and the other person can come in with the hostage at the back door. And the middleman takes a cut from making that particular exchange work by saying, well, you're safe here. The police never come to my shop. So again, we see lots of ways of creating self-enforcing contracts, and all of them rely on that time horizon, on the repeated interaction. So all these cooperative outcomes are only possible because of the structure of the insurance industry. There's only one place where you can get kidnapped for ransom insurance. Yeah? You might feel like there are lots of options, but ultimately all of it is underwritten in Lloyd's of London. So it's the Lloyd's market. You can go to a broker and they go to Lloyd's. You go to your insurer, they might just sell you straight Lloyd's insurance. They might sell you something that looks like their own product, but they're actually getting it from Lloyd's, or they reinsure it at Lloyd's. Yeah? So ultimately, all kidnap for ransom insurance is underwritten at Lloyd's of London. It's a market. There are 3 or 4 insurers, one of them absolutely clearly the market leader, then 2 or 3 other companies that do a lot of this business, and then altogether there are 20 that underwrite this product. They all sit, almost all of them sit in the downstairs part of Lloyd's within spitting distance of each other. They go to lunch together. They know each other's successes. They know each other's failures. It's a very gossipy community. And it's a club. And it's a club that manages its processes, it sets its norms. And if you don't do things the way that the market leaders do, then you are out of underwriting kidnap for ransom insurance. You know? So if you want to have access to being able to market this somewhat profitable product, I hear it's an unproblematic one as far as Lloyd's is concerned, whatever that means, then you've got to follow the rules of the club. So it's a very elegant solution for people not to cut corners, to keep the ransom discipline, even if it takes that little bit longer, not to cut the corners, not to offer too much too fast, to really reward crisis responders and security consultants who do their job well. Because ultimately every mistake that's made comes back to haunt that group of people, because it's repeat business. Which is in complete contrast to the alternative where you have states negotiating the return of their citizens. Because A, they don't have a credible financial constraint. Why only 30 million? What's wrong with 40 million? So, but also, you don't have that coordinating mechanism. Yeah? So if the Swiss government is negotiating over the return of one of their citizens, they just hope and pray that the next hostage crisis will be Italian or French or German or Belgian or anything other than Swiss. Yeah? That's not the way the underwriting room works. They know it's all going to come and hit them. So they're managing it as a club in a way that governments don't do. And yes, the other real problem about the way that governments negotiate is that some governments don't negotiate. Therefore, they massively reduce the financial value of those hostages, unless, of course, you can double the price on a French hostage by being beastly to a US or a Canadian or a British hostage. Yeah? That's why British hostages die in terrorist kidnaps, because you can kill the Brit and you more than recoup that money on your portfolio of hostages. That is not how the private market works, yeah? Because they're saying it goes down to the family level, and if you kill this hostage, then this family's out of the game. Yeah? So it's a really interesting product, and it works because it creates repeated interactions over time, but also across firms. It does that by facilitating amazing information flow about protectors, about middlemen, about all these other service providers, and about kidnappers. So very discrete information flow, things that people don't want to talk about, you don't want to advertise. There's no Rate My Kidnapper app. If there was, then we wouldn't need this as much as we do now. So, but it's a fantastic way of pooling information and reacting as a group. And to me, what has been utterly fascinating as an economist has been the sheer creativity of this group of people in creating self-enforcing contracts where cooperative behaviour is rewarded and all the rogues face massive sanctions in the subsequent exchanges. And the final thing that really struck me is how much skin in the game there is. So if you get things wrong, if you misbehave, if you make mistakes, that's severely career limiting. And mistakes don't persist because they're very, very costly to everyone. Right,
brilliant.
We'll leave it there.
Well, thank you very much. Well, I told you it would be a fascinating insight. I'd now like to ask Orit Gull, who is at Regent's University, lectures in complexity economics, and has also worked in this area. And I've known her for a long time and have been always sort of amazed by her way of thinking about complex systems. So if you'd like to come up and...
That was absolutely fascinating. I love the book. Thinking about it, I think that beyond the content itself, which is an amazing story, it's also such a wonderful case study for really understanding how markets emerge. Really the microscopic kind of iterative behavior that actually creates markets, which is kind of my passion. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, as I was thinking through that, on loads of things, but I'll highlight two of them. First of all, in terms of how information flows, because this is all based on trust mechanisms that require close interactions within networks. Yeah. So is there a specific structure of the network that seems to repeat itself? How do people signal to each other? I mean, obviously you said the people at Lloyd sit, closely, so there is actual physical proximity. But you have a much wider network emerging here over time. Some of it is filled with legal players, right? And part of it is filled with illegal players, but they're all part of one network. And everyone needs to share that information because otherwise, actually you described some of the kidnappings in some settings as actual market failure, a failure of the mm-hmm. signal, because if everybody knew what they should expect, they would pay the £100 not to get kidnapped, and they wouldn't have to reach that level. So I'd love to hear more from you about how the networks actually play, and is there a limit to the size of a network where these trust mechanisms can actually emerge?
Yes, super question. So Lloyd's has recently been in the press where people say this is just an old boys network and they're hostile to minorities and they're not inclusive and diverse enough. I'm also slightly worried about this because the reason this particular system works is that they're recruiting from a very specific group of people, which is elite military and security forces people. So they've all seen each other in conflict. They know they can trust each other. They only get asked to join if they're extremely good at what they do, and they do a range of tasks. So often the security, so it's security consulting, being a broker, being a crisis responder. They circulate between these jobs. And they have a very curious mixture of skills. So you might think, oh, well, here we have a club. There's only a few people. I'm really worried about the market for insurance and about collusion, etc. So is this a market at all, or is this all sewn up? So what you have is these people who are intensely competitive. They do want to compete. That is part of their mindset. They want to compete and they want to win. And yet they're also willing and able to communicate and cooperate. And they look out for each other, and they don't want each other to make mistakes, because these mistakes impinge on themselves. Yeah. So if I watch somebody walk into a trap, then I know that next time I'm meeting that opposition, their expectation are not at 10,000 but at 50,000. I really don't want that. So I'm better off sharing information. And that's what they do. So they have competitiveness and cooperation somehow bred into them. And they know they can trust each other. I mean, there are no incentives to deviate either, because you know that, yes, you will give information about how to best handle a case. That's in my interest. You handling it well is in my interest. But also I know that you're actually better at a different territory. So if one of my people gets kidnapped, I'll want to know. I want to have access to the Mali expert. I want to have access to the Colombia expert. So
do you see a mirror specialization emerging on the other side as well? Because obviously kidnappers are there not for a one-off transaction. They're also thinking in this multi-game kind of mindset. They also need to share information and make sure that, you know, they could kidnap the next one and the next one. I would expect specialization and expertise and trust mechanisms to emerge there as well. I don't know if you...
Yeah, absolutely. And that's... I mean, the crisis responder's nightmare is a lone crazy individual who's just got hold of a tourist, who doesn't really know what to do and is so nervous. That those are the ones that are likely to go wrong. But you can usually resolve them by taking it one level up and asking the Don what's going on in his territory, and can he sort it out himself. So yes, ultimately you are dealing with groups that are in repeated business. You might find specialization in terms of negotiators. So with Somalia, that's certainly something that we saw, that people were talking to the same people, literally to the same person again and again, because there are people who are good at negotiating on behalf of pirates, and they were very competitive with each other, and they had these sort of running tallies saying, oh yes, this is a phone call where we get the threat with X, and this is what we say, and they, on the other side, they would say, yeah, that's what they always say, but then. So it can get quite theatrical, but then for neither side is there any incentive to deviate from the equilibrium behaviour of creating an environment in which cooperative outcomes are the norm, and you can enforce those norms by the way, for example, you structure the payments process. So with the Somali payments process, it eventually converged on airdrops, so that the ransom would be dropped next to the ships by small aircraft. And the norm for this process was that there would be 2 flypasts. On the first flypast, all the crew would have to be standing on deck and waving, and only on the second flypast would the ransom be dropped. Yeah. So the waving was because on one occasion it unfortunately lost one of the crew members. They put him in the deep freeze, so they had one person sort of leaning against the railing, and they got away with that.
The frozen person couldn't wave.
So, but making them wave then created a very clear incentive to make sure you've got to have that preservation of life, and if you don't manage to keep everyone alive, you need to be upfront and honest about it, because if we don't count 21 people waving, there's not going to be a ransom. So you need to be honest, you need to be true, you need to be non-violent. So it's these norms of non-violence.
Just to elaborate on that, you said they dropped the money, so is it dropped in the sea so that the kidnappers have to get out of the boat?
No, they'd have small boats. Then they always, almost always, distributed the money to all the stakeholders and shareholders on the boat, and then they came off. Right. But I mean, that was one of the things that motivated my research. Was why do they always come off? Yeah. And why hasn't a single boat that has been properly ransomed been re-hijacked? Given that would be the obvious target, being crewed by a traumatized crew, low on fuel and soiled from 6 months at anchorage. You couldn't get an easier target, yet none of them is kidnapped. So by paying a ransom, you're effectively entering a new protection contract with that kidnapper.
So I guess the second issue, I guess, here is scale. So it has to stay small.
Oh, yes.
So at some point, if it becomes too big, you cannot share all of that information, all that signaling. You cannot actually create those trust mechanisms. So you would have a breakup of different markets to different areas. And I was just wondering about the scalability, because I'm sure you've read the news, for example, about Baltimore. So the city of Baltimore has been held for ransom for about a month now, with somebody that shut off all of their online servers, internet, everything. And they were just asking for £100,000, which kind of seemed, well, reasonable. Which of course they said no, and now it's going to cost them tens of millions. And I'm just wondering, again, this is a completely different element when we're moving into cyber. Is there an element of these kind of mechanisms that can be replicated on a much bigger scale? Do you see any potential for that?
Yeah, so the same people who insure kidnap for ransom also insure people against cybercrime. Mm-hmm. And you get the same thing. If you want to get that insurance, you also need to do something about your cyber security, so your customers don't get kidnapped. But yeah, if a cyber crime occurs, it's the same thing. Proof of life, proof of possession, and let's talk about a price. But again,
it's much harder because you don't have the same locality, the same people. Again, the scaling up of this market is completely different.
Yes, so but again, you need to make sure that it's not that profitable. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in a way, it's the same as kidnap. You might spend a lot of money on the resolution, probably several orders of magnitude more than the ransom that actually gets paid. But that's the point. Yeah. If you make it easy for cyber criminals, you're not going to see the end of cyber criminality. So it's about making it hardly worthwhile doing,
and yet sustaining the market. Because you're sustaining a protection market at the end of the day.
Yeah, there's no threat. Mm-hmm. You can't offer insurance.
Yeah.
Yes, that is right. But the insurance is offered for places in which there is a kidnap risk. They didn't invent the kidnap risk.
No.
We're not selling kidnap insurance for Switzerland. And,
But you couldn't, if the kidnap risk went away because there was nothing in it, then there'd be no one would need insurance, and they wouldn't make any money out of it. So there is a sort of mutual, both have to exist. They can't kill the kidnap business, because if the kidnap business is dead, the insurance business is dead as well.
Yeah, I've met this often as an argument. I mean, I think it's the market for hostages is big enough for them not to worry if there's somewhere that suddenly doesn't have kidnapping anymore. That's fine. Yeah.
Shall we open?
No, but it's a good question. So my counter question is, if you wanted to organise it, say, well, we need at least 10 foreigners to be kidnapped in this particular region, so that people will continue to be worried about foreigners being kidnapped, then the question is, well, who's going to let their customer be kidnapped? And organising that, I think, is beyond the scope even of the underwriting room at Lloyd's.
But there might be a certain sense that on the criminal side, that now and again, things have to happen, whatever, and it's not them who's lost.
Usually it's the local kidnap market that's driving the demand for kidnap insurance. Yeah, you know it's a kidnap hotspot. You know that there are lots of kidnappings that are happening there, so you know the threat exists. You know that there are people with criminal capital who can kidnap in this region. But it's very, very rare that a foreigner gets kidnapped, so these transnational cases are very rare.
Can I, just before I go to sort of put this in a bigger context, actually, because if you can imagine that violence came before markets in the world, that initially societies, medieval societies, etc., organisation was done on the basis of violence, and they underpinned relationships. So your case study could, in a sense, I was going to say something really deep at that point.
It's going to be the best comment of the day.
We'll return to it. But I was thinking that, that it could be an example of how actually evolution has happened from a sort of violence-based societies into market-based societies across the world. And of course, they have evolved away from the dominance of king. King has then turned into a sort of quasi-democracy over time, etc., etc. I think you really should look at parallels with the emergence of markets in, in medieval or something like that.
Well, no, absolutely.
Yes,
but
as I was reading that with the-
medieval hostages, you also get these ransom cartels.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that a lot of these structures were, and how they evolved, and how did we move from there to where we are today would be. Welcome back. Everyone counting. Did you count anyone being kidnapped?
They'll all escape now.
Come back, or somebody got caught in the process. Yeah, we'll do that. Yeah, I think I'm doing it.
Yeah. We'll go a bit longer. Okay, I think we may have lost one or two people, but hopefully not many people. I'm just going to go back because we'll have to sort of cut it, and the alarm went sort of mid-sentence, so I'm using that as an excuse just to make the observation again that you could say that this is a sort of case study of how history has evolved, in that all societies have come from a more violent society where a lot of the economic transactions were through property violence. And then out of that came markets and the institutions. And I wonder if you thought of maybe taking this as an example of almost a modern day case study, which you could then compare and contrast with the emergence of markets out of medieval times or out of other societies where violence has reduced and markets have sort of increased, if you like.
Yeah, so we're talking about societies that are often a long way away from our democratic systems, where you just pay your taxes and then the state forces keep you safe, more or less. So you might be in a country where there might be a legitimate government, or at least a internationally recognised government, but it might just not project power in the region where you want to be, or they might be very corrupt and the taxes are not really, don't buy you very much in terms of protection, so you need to make additional arrangements. And so the security consulting is about saying, well, can we solve this with money rather than with violence? They're extremely pragmatic about it, and you might say, oh, this looks horribly corrupt, but then on the other hand, if you do have some dictator in Kinshasa who can't give you any protection, you have a local community that needs to be on board, then probably it's a good idea to pay them something.
Than the alternative.
As well.
Okay, let's. Were you going to ask a question? Or sorry, no. Who would like to? Sorry.
I mean, it's fascinating talk, and the mechanics is fascinating, but I think what's equally fascinating is just the ethics, the sort of questions of what's right and wrong here, in a situation essentially when you say that the rule of law has broken down. Mm-hmm. Have you looked at the ethics of it?
Well, I mean, I'm very interested in the ethics of paying ransoms at all.
Yeah.
Yeah. So because if you're paying a ransom to a criminal organisation or a rebel organisation or a terrorist organisation, then the chances are that they are going to invest any profits from that into crime, rebellion or terror. And therefore my ransom that brings back my loved one might immiserate other people, and therefore it's a really strong moral, ethical problem here. What I find interesting is that this economic solution to making kidnapping insurable also ends up being a surprisingly and elegantly ethical solution, because if they're not making a profit from kidnapping, then that's the best possible way of squaring that circle. You say, I do want my loved one back, but not at the price of other people being killed, tortured, and predated on in some other ways. So I mean, we have all these surveys, and whatever, 95% of people think we should never negotiate with terrorists, and 97% of people would do whatever it takes to get their loved ones back from terrorists. So we're all conflicted in this. And here we have a solution that to me seems like a surprisingly elegant compromise between these irreconcilable positions.
Left, yeah.
I can think of any number of questions. My response to what you just said is, what is your evidence that this is not profitable, however that's defined? I mean, anecdotally, it's said that Nairobi property prices, to some extent, reflect Somali ransom income.
Yeah. Okay. So Somalia is one of these examples where ransoms got away of massive ransom inflation, and the market becoming uninsurable, and eventually it having to be resolved militarily and with private security. So the equilibrium situation, Somalia has always been pirate territory. Yeah, so even in the 19th century, the British Navy sent out gunboats to stop sea scavenging in the Gulf of Aden. So for many years, this was something that was just dealt with in the shipping community, and every year about half a dozen ships got caught by Somali fishermen, and they were let go after 3 months for $100,000. That was perfectly insurable, and with a large group of people organising the protection of a ship for 3 months would cost about $100,000. The problem with Somalia was that somebody then jumped the gun and said, well, but we want our ship back after 2 weeks, and we'd quite happily pay you $1 million. And that just broke that consensus where people thought, oh, so it's worth $1 million, is it? Oh, maybe a bit more? What if we keep it for another 2 weeks? Would you be going up on this? Yeah. So as long as you got this really tight lid on ransoms, where everyone behaves in a particular way, so then you don't get this disequilibrium behaviour where people get really squeezed. But you say this is going to resolve after 4 or 5 days for $10,000. If somebody goes into Nigeria, into the Niger Delta, and pays these pirates $30,000 or $50,000, this can get away as well. Yeah, so it really relies on very tight ransom discipline. We see big ransoms, but then you can be pretty sure that there have been several dozen people involved in guarding the hostage and doing the surveillance for getting the hostage in the first place, and they all sat on that hostage for 18 months.
Okay,
how much of this sort of thing goes on? I mean, we, not involved in the slightest bit with it, we hear in the press very occasionally, but from the sound of it, there are a lot more of these cases than the few that hit the headlines.
there are more than those that hit the headlines, and the ones that hit the headlines are the ones that go wrong.
Yeah.
So the top firm in the business and the crisis response business has about 3,000 cases that they have resolved.
Over how long a period?
45 years.
Right.
So it doesn't happen that often. So plan A is it doesn't happen, but plan B is pretty good. It's pretty successful.
Well, that's still, an average of 60 a year or something from the numbers you gave us.
Yeah. So
it's a lot more.
almost all kidnaps are local on local with no foreign involvement at all. So it's a transnational ones that, where you have a foreign insurer, a foreign company, or a foreigner being capped. But you'd think that those would be the most attractive targets for kidnapping, and yet it almost never happens.
Right.
Compared to the hundreds of thousands of people who are at risk.
So it's a company, an oil company that's operating in Kenya or somewhere. Are they paying an insurance premium so that, if any of their staff are kidnapped, it will get organised, and anything that has to be paid will be paid by the underwriters?
That is the idea. Yeah, you can organise it yourself, but there is this product, and this product works. And if you go for the DIY option, and your hostage gets killed, then you also have the problem of any litigation that arises out of you having cut the corners on that. Whereas if you have insurance, then the cost of litigation is also covered, because the chances of being found negligent are very low indeed.
And the insurance underwriter pays the ransom?
Reimburses the ransom.
Reimburses.
Yeah, so it's on a reimbursement basis, and that's important. You've got to raise it first, and that also puts a lid on how much you can raise.
Anthony.
What's curious, a little bit, one doesn't hear so much about which of the countries, you mentioned Nigeria and Somaliland, how many countries is this a sort of risk at? You touched on Italy, where you yourself was, I think.
Yeah, so, I think of kidnapping as disequilibrium behaviour. So if you know who to pay, then there is not going to, and you know how much to pay them and how to pay them, there is not going to be a kidnapping problem. So you've got lots of territories where it's very clear that the central government doesn't have control, and yet there is no kidnapping. So kidnapping is always associated with territorial conflict. So Syria, Iraq,
Right.
South Sudan, South Central Somalia. Somaliland is perfectly fine. We know who orders Somaliland. Yeah, Puntland is not really a problem. Yeah, there are ways of getting, easy ways of getting protection in Puntland, I'm told.
Okay.
But it's where you don't know who to pay, how to pay them, or they're not sure how much to charge you. That's where you might get into these frictional situations.
It's fascinating, the knowledge that obviously Lloyd has to know which countries, which etc. There's a huge amount.
And it's quite a process to get that insurance. And there's this book by this guy called Jerry Van Dyke, who got kidnapped in tribal territories of Pakistan, and he thought he was kidnapped by the Taliban. He was ransomed, and then he wanted to go off and investigate the circumstances of his kidnap and the background. And he was really miffed because there's only one place to get insurance, and he found they wouldn't give him any insurance. And I thought it's a really stupid thing to do. There should not be insurance for this. So making something uninsurable is also a way of enforcing that discipline on the protector. Saying, well, if we're making it uninsurable, nobody's going to come to your territory, so you better sort it out.
Yeah. I'm just going to challenge you on something. I'll come back, but your use of language of equilibrium and disequilibrium.
Mm-hmm.
And that sort of implies that we're dealing with a market in terms of how mainstream economics sees a market. And I would suggest that what you're looking at is quite the reverse, is totally different from the picture of markets that mainstream economics gives. Because mainstream economics suggests that the players in the market have no connection with each other apart from the interaction, the deal. And what you've actually described is huge amounts of connections, structures, institutions to make the market work. And actually, that's what happens in normal markets as well. You have all sorts of structures, you have major players that control and structure the market so other people have certainty, you have all sorts of relationships. So actually, the story you've told is one that is in all markets and is about all sorts of institutions, relationships outside and beyond the actual market interactions. And disequilibrium behaviour, there's no, in standard economics that makes no sense. There's no such thing as disequilibrium behaviour. There's markets that are out of equilibrium. So I would suggest that you're smuggling in language from mainstream economics to cover the fact that actually you're talking about something totally different.
Well, I'm talking about strategic interactions.
Yeah,
and
which don't happen in markets. Don't happen in the picture of mainstream markets that we're told. There's no strategic interactions.
So I'm looking at protection. And
No, I know what you're talking about. I understand.
Yeah,
I think you're absolutely right.
Protection is always monopolistically supplied in equilibrium. If you have several people who are saying, pay me and you won't get kidnapped, you think, well, which one of you do I pay? Yeah?
So it's not a normal market.
No, it's not a normal market,
But it is, well, it is a normal market, but it's not the market that is portrayed in standard economics.
No, but I still think there are equilibrium strategies, and there are...
Mainstream economics, which 101 equilibrium strategies, is that, where does that fit in?
I think we're beyond economics 101.
Well, I know, but I think we are, but that's it. But
yeah.
when you're talking about equilibrium, that is economics 101 is equilibrium.
Well, I'm thinking more of, do we have a Nash equilibrium? Do we have a dominant strategy? So we're talking about ultimately possibly many players against one, but the bundling then ends up with two players saying, what's the price for protection in this particular territory, given that I can pull out everybody from your territory.
But it's not even game theory, is it? Because yes, there's power relations, and there's also the fact that the players actually have long bonds and understanding of.
Yeah.
There's social norms here, which
yes.
game theory doesn't.
And reputations.
Yeah.
That
so it's well beyond game theory, isn't it?
Well, it's certainly well beyond what game theorists are comfortable modelling, and that's where your complexity comes in. I'm embracing the complexity.
You're embracing it. Okay, great. Let's open that. Well, I won't give you any more.
I just add, I think a lot of it is just about the time element. So a lot of these equilibriums, and as you said, they're really, really fragile. So the ecology within which all of this plays out will continue to evolve. So they might hold on for a certain point in time because all the conditions are right in terms of who's supplying what and the information that flows, but obviously it's not the kind of how you would think of traditional equilibrium that is just fixed and there for life.
Yeah, it's
a
relative to the
element.
institutions
and
and norms.
The interesting thing about this hugely complex system that I'm looking at here is that the people who are in it weren't aware of it. Because everyone just say, well, I'm just a problem solver, but they're all sort of patches solving specific governance problems where trades fail. So if it always fails at the middleman stage, or you've got the middleman but you can't get the money into the country because you've got the problem of crossing the border with a sack full of cash. Yeah, so you get all these problem solvers the ones who do the ransom, who drop the ransom, the ones who negotiate the ransom, the ones who craft the protection contract, etc. So they all said, oh well, all I'm doing is solving a very small, very tiny problem. And nobody actually zoomed out and said, well, there's a logic.
But there are sort of very strong, which you describe, very strong social norms that people have to play the game in the same way. If they don't play the game according to the social norms, they're out.
Yes.
So that means that that defines the nature of the game that people play with it, and it falls to bits. You've got people who don't follow the social norms, and of course, social norms don't exist in economics, do they? Anyway, who would like to add in?
Yeah, I really enjoyed the talk. It's very interesting, and I don't know what the connection was with anything that I was sort of like thinking about in my own sort of stuff. But then I realised that when Henry talked about history and the historical process, I don't know if you know about the Anglo-Saxon were-guilt, which means man price, because there was these Anglo-Saxon communities like in the United Kingdom at that time, right, where there was no central government, but you would have people stealing rich people from the neighbouring clan, if you like, but there was an agreed price that you would pay for that person depending on their rank. So that was a social norm, I suppose, to do with kidnapping, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I don't know how that would tie into what you're talking about.
Yeah, but those social norms are still alive in some areas of the world, and again they're very strong. So, and it's only when governments get involved that they sometimes get broken. But so for years, in Yemen, people would get kidnapped, and it was a form of. By the locals, it was considered a form of enforced hospitality or adventure tourism. It was very clear that nothing would happen to the hostages. They would just be treated to far too much, far too sweet tea in tents until their captors got whatever they wanted, usually a new bus route or a generator for their village out of the central government. It is a way of getting the government's attention. And it's only when you get this parallel market for hostages developing, with Al-Qaeda getting $1 million, that you see hostages migrating from that tribal kidnap sector to the terrorist sector, because, well, as far as we're concerned, we can sort of have a dividing line and say this is criminal and this is terrorist. But if you pay $5,000 in one market, $1 million in another market, well, there's no reason why they shouldn't give $5,000 to them and get the $1 million there.
But it's interesting what counts as terrorism, isn't it? I mean, is it really that their objectives are to disrupt the institutions, whereas the criminal networks are actually, in effect, are working with the current institutions to sort of, they're into mutual survival, whereas terrorists are into destruction, if you like, and that makes them different. It's not that they both kill people, they both use violence to get money, it's just that the objectives are different.
I'm not so sure, in the sense that if there is a political organisation that gets faced with a Lloyd's negotiator, and the Lloyd's negotiator says, yes, it's all very well with your political things, but A, we're just a family, B, we don't have very much money, and C, there's nothing we can do to influence our government's position on your rebel group. All you can get is money and not very much of it. Eventually they tend to settle for not very much money. If you put a bureaucrat on the phone, and then the sweetie tin is open in terms of prisoner exchanges, policy changes, as much money as he can think of. So what we observe is that if you have this relabeling going on, so you flick a switch, Abu Sayyaf associates with Daesh, and from now on we have to consider them terrorists, whereas previously we ignored all their political agenda or just treated them as criminals, then the very next ransom is 1 or 2 orders of magnitude higher. And you think, well, nothing's really changed. Still the same people, but they're negotiating with a different counterparty, you're going to get vastly different outcomes. It's worrying.
So why wouldn't you?
Well, exactly.
Anyone?
So what happens if they're demanding an exchange of prisoners rather than money?
Well, it depends on whether you can deliver that. Yeah? So if it's a family negotiating or a firm negotiating, there's nothing they can do. They can just say, well, we can't do that.
Yeah. So then it has to go to a different then it has to go to the government, is it?
Well, but governments won't get involved because there's no reason to get involved because there's a perfectly functioning process. So eventually they'll get the message that there isn't a prisoner exchange.
But then how do terrorists get to access government? Presumably the trick is to end up negotiating with government and
Absolutely.
to refuse to negotiate with the Lloyds.
That's not how it works. So if it's a prescribed organisation, then it's illegal to facilitate a ransom, and therefore Lloyd's leaves the picture.
So actually by making yourself prescribed, you increase your potential to get revenue.
Absolutely. So we had this really interesting political exercise in 2012 where people had spotted that there seemed to be a connection between Al-Shabaab and the pirates, and the Foreign Commonwealth Office made this consultation to see whether we should prescribe Somali piracy as a terrorist activity. And basically the ship owners just started lobbying and said, we're never going to get our ships, our cargo and our crew back.
And they wouldn't be able to get insurance either, would they?
And they wouldn't get insurance. Yeah. So you would just destroy the system that safely retrieved crew, cargo and ships from the Somali pirates. And they weren't particularly diligent in trying to find what the connections between the Shabaab and the pirates were. Even if you saw that there were ships that were parked within spitting distance of Shabaab territory or off the coast of Shabaab territory, they didn't really want to know because it would have just completely wrecked the system, and it would really put lives and ships at risk, and nobody was willing to do that. Yeah.
I'm really interested to know how this group at Lloyd's started off, because I can see how it works now. You've got all this bundling and so on, but initially they wouldn't have had that. So how did they start off?
So it starts off in 1932 when, after the kidnapping of Charles Lindbergh's son, American millionaires get worried about their vulnerability, so they start insuring. And it's just a pure insurance product without any of the associated services. But the insurers realize quite soon that there are problems unless you're somewhat cautious about who you insure and what the conditions are, and setting limits and making sure that's on a reimbursement basis, making sure that the insurance contract can't be used as collateral to make it more difficult for families to raise the ransoms. And then with the Argentina one, they start really pushing in the patches and saying, look, we need crisis response, we need disruptive bargaining, we need to make it much more difficult to get a sizable ransom.
Was that with Lloyd's in 1936?
Yeah, that's where it's at. I mean, you sometimes have other people doing it. Yeah, so it's not that there's a complete monopoly. So we can try and sell kidnap insurance. But we go out of business very quickly because we wouldn't know where to pitch the price because we don't have enough information to predict what's going to happen, and our customers will fare very badly. So it would not be a viable product.
But basically what you're describing is a sort of learning process in a complex system where people experiment and try and grow and learn from
absolutely.
each other.
But they experiment, but it's always very, very clear when an experiment has failed, and people see it on their bottom line, and they do gossip, and they say, well, we asked so-and-so to do this, and they didn't deliver, but we've got this really good guy here, and he names his price, so there's very strong incentive. That's what I mean about skin in the game.
So it has become an epidemic in two cases that we know of recently. One is the Somali ships, and the other is Nigerian oil company.
No, the Argentina.
Sorry,
Argentina.
Argentina. Yeah, but in Nigeria there were quite a lot of kidnapping of oil shell people. I know this because I met earlier this year somebody who'd been working for Shell, and he'd actually volunteered to be taken as a hostage to find out why it was that they were kidnapping people. And so he actually went and was a hostage for some time and talked to the people and got to know them. I think this quite often happens with hostages, doesn't it? That they begin to understand the point of view of the hostage takers, and so when he came back from being a hostage taker, he became a consultant.
A great business strategy, isn't it?
But he also became an activist trying to get Shell to do, not to pollute so much the River Niger and so on.
Yeah, I wouldn't say Nigeria is a case where it's got out of hand, in the sense that if it happens, yeah, you've got enough territorial conflict in the Niger Delta for people not always to know who can protect them. So there is kidnapping, but basically everyone comes home alive for not very much money within a reasonable amount of time. So it's just a cost of doing business in that area. It's not disruptive, and when it gets to be disruptive, then they just say, okay, well, we're all out, you sort it out. But yeah, I mean, the security consultant role is, well, how do you make a protection contract with the local community so that they're broadly happy with us being here? What I would describe as an equilibrium solution.
Social license is another way of that.
I'm really fascinated by the ingenuity that's brought to bear on this rather tricky situation. And there are some market qualities in what you've been describing, I'm sure. But it does seem to be the result of a complete and utter failure of market. And by that I mean that ordinary people aren't really able to live ordinary lives. There's situations, I mean, you spoke of the conflict in some of these territories, but this does not seem to be the best way of the people of the world living. And it seems ultimately there must be a better way. This is not to say anything about the market, but it's born out of a complete failure of opportunity for people in Somalia, for instance.
Well, absolutely. And you find that there are these territories where people just have not been able to resolve conflict, and some of these territories are going to be so dysfunctional that it's impossible to get insurance. But the ones that do get insurance, it's mining companies and it's oil companies where the overall profitability of the enterprise is such that it's worth getting involved in these territories. But it wouldn't be worth doing it for a garment factory. So yeah, I completely agree with you. I wouldn't say it's a market failure, it's a failure of governance.
Yes, it is.
But given that there is a failure of governance, do you have to withdraw entirely, or can you come to a pragmatic solution? Yes, if the activity is profitable enough to do it.
But I just say, I'm not saying that this doesn't have attributes of markets. I think markets work generally like this. They don't work like textbooks suggest they do, and the term equilibrium is associated with how textbooks describe markets, not in terms of a sort of institutional social norms sort of story that I think Anja is telling us.
So obviously there's quite an investment for Lloyd or whoever's negotiating to not let the price spiral because they can see the long-term picture. But how do they? It must be quite difficult for them to control the people whose loved ones have been taken from just saying, I don't want my husband or my son or my daughter to be a hostage for 18 months. I'd rather just pay $1 million and I'll sell everything I own. How do they keep that buffer without the hostage takers knowing that they're dealing with a business who have the access to millions?
Right. So, if you think of this like an economist, then you'd say, well, where is this interaction going to end? And you would say, well, it's going to end at the point where the cost of keeping the hostage for one additional period is less than the money that you can get. Yeah? So if it costs them $800 a month to hold a hostage, they will keep squeezing until they're just going to get that extra 800. So if you start off with $1 million, then there'll be an expectation of more than that. So they will keep holding on. So it's not a price. It's not like you walk into a supermarket and say, I'm just gonna grab it off the shelf and I'm paying you whatever you like. The price is not. We're talking about a self-enforcing contract. The price embodies a self-enforcing contract. And if you say, yes, I'm happy to pay $1 million, that's fine. They say, okay, what about $2 million or $5 million?
But how do they prevent people who haven't had the experience of dealing with?
Well, most people who are in this situation will be very, very pleased to find that there's somebody who will give them advice. And he says, I've done this 100 times before. This is going to be, if you hold your nerve, that we're going to be out of this in 4 days for $10,000. Offer them 500. Offer them 2,000. Yeah, that's all that they should earn for an afternoon's work in this context. Yeah, be distracted. So it's really, really tricky because people just think that there must be a trade-off between time and money. But there isn't. Because ultimately they will squeeze you dry. And the more money you start off with, the more money they think they can get by squeezing harder and harder. And every time you reward bad behaviour, you're going to get more of it. I don't know whether you have children. But if you find another $50,000 every time somebody twists your husband's arm or puts a gun to his head, then you're going to see a lot more of that kind of behaviour, and it's very easy to escalate it from there. So it's about taking a very clear line with threats, saying they're not productive, they're counterproductive, I can't talk to you when you're doing this. I need to take it back to my board. I need to discuss this with the family, keep the hostage safe. In the meantime, I'll get back to you. Yeah, I don't think I'm going to be able to get an appointment with my bank manager until next Monday now. You look after the hostage. Really test their patience. And it works. I mean, we know that 97.5% of hostages come back. Some people die of pre-existing medical conditions and some people try to escape. But barring that, the system works.
I'm just going to... We've gone a bit over because we had the fire alarm and so forth, but I think we are due some wine.
Yeah, it's ready to go. Yeah.
Brilliant. Where is it? Is it?
Just there, yeah.
Oh, you've got it all there.
Yes.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
But I just thought, Orit, you haven't done a chance. Do you want to make some final remarks before any sort of reflections?
I don't want to keep anyone from the wine, but I think that again, it's fascinating to take this specific case study and see how it relates to other markets, to other ecologies, to other phenomena, and really, what is fascinating is what is the constraints of this market. So for example, the fact that it can only operate in small groups. So what does it mean when you need to cover a wider area, whether it's geographically or in terms of people? How do you actually, can you replicate those information flows that create these great mechanisms of trust? And can we take anything from those elements and actually try to replicate them in places where we need more trust mechanisms in other places in the market? So to try to take these elements out of it.
Brilliant. Okay, well, thank you very much, Anja, and thank you very much, Orit. That was absolutely fascinating.